Hello and welcome. Thank you for watching this Gender Cafe recording, Intersecting Struggles, Shared Futures, Advancing LGBTQI plus rights across Africa and South America. My name is Brian Cooch. I use they, them pronouns, and I am part of the co-leadership of the Society of Gender Professionals in various spaces and roles, including co-leading the Breaking Gender and Sex Binary Circle, where we build community and discuss issues related to LGBTQI plus advocacy. I would be remiss if I missed any opportunity to share that gender oppression does not just impact cisgender women, but also trans, queer, and intersex people who dare to live outside of the gender and sex norms that have been imposed on them. Thus, LGBTQI plus experiences are really critical component of gender conversations, which I'm sure you know if you are watching this recording. We are incredibly grateful to have hosted this conversation in December 2025 as we united across continents to explore both the remarkable advances and persistent challenges facing LGBTQI plus communities, to learn from diverse activist strategies, and to strengthen our cross-regional solidarity. Co-hosted by the Society of Gender Professionals and CCINDLE, who I will introduce shortly, this event amplified transformative voices, honored lived realities, and charted paths towards gender justice together. We did have a bit of an issue with the live recording, so as you can probably tell, I am re-recording the introduction, and then I will pass it over to SGP co-president Francesca Traglia, who will moderate this excellent panel with experts and activists from around the world. First up, I want to introduce the Society of Gender Professionals, or SGP. We are an international organization that bridges the gap between gender professionals, activists, and academicians to combine our collective knowledge and expertise to achieve SGP's mission: producing and disseminating knowledge, exchanging resources, advancing gender justice through coordinated feminist action, promoting intersectional gender expertise, strengthening connections between theory, policy, and practice, and of course, supporting collaboration and community building towards stronger feminist co-leadership. Then this Gender Cafe is done in collaboration with the CCINDLE project, as I mentioned, which stands for Co-Creating Inclusive Intersectional Democratic Spaces Across Europe. So you can see why we use the acronym. SGP as well is quite long. So CCINDLE is a Europe-based project that collaborates with grassroots activists, institutions, and gender professionals to co-create knowledge on anti-gender campaigns, and particularly how they challenge democracy through violence and politics of knowledge, democratic and social futures based in feminist theory and practice, and feminist movements and responses to anti-gender and anti-democratic forces. We're very pleased and lucky to have Dr. Connie Ragaband here with us during the event, who is one of the CCINDLE program leads from the University of Amsterdam. Then the objectives of this Gender Cafe are to understand the drivers of anti-LGBTQI plus movements in Africa and South America, with some information around South Asia as well, to compare regional experiences, challenges, and victories for LGBTQI plus rights, and just really uplifting. The victories are essential to celebrate, to share, to learn from, and they often get overshadowed by the setbacks. We were here to amplify activist voices and community-led strategies for change, to build cross-regional solidarity and transnational feminist connections, and then to chart pathways forward for advancing gender justice globally. Now I'll introduce our speakers. So first, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Amanda Odoye, a feminist, gender justice advocate, and scholar from Ghana. Dr. Odoye's research with the Center for Gender Research, Advocacy, and Documentation at the University of Cape Coast interrogates feminism, sexualities, and LGBTQI+ organizing with a focus on Ghana and West Africa. She has shaped national gender policy, mentored young feminists, and leads intersectional research on feminist organizing and social resistance to LGBTQI+ rights. Next, Brenda Lakshmi K brings a perspective from the intersection of queer feminist advocacy, research, and journalism in India and broader South Asia. Brenda's work highlights digital rights, consent, and community-centered activism, exemplified by studies like gendering of development data and their workshops on intersectionality and security for the LGBTQIA+ community. Their experience challenges us to connect data, human rights, and lived resistance. And I'm also very happy to share that they are a part of the SGP co-leadership as well. So I get to hang out with them. Then we have Professor Javier Corrales, who is based at Amherst College in the United States. Professor Corrales is an internationally recognized for his research on democratization, political backsliding, populism, and gender and sexuality rights in Latin America. His scholarship, including seminal works like Autocracy Rising and The Politics of LGBTQ Rights Expansion in Latin America and the Caribbean, has helped us understand not only the legal change, but the dynamics of homophobic populism and the resilience of social movements across the Americas. Finally, Marcela Romero is a leading Argentine and regional transgender activist. For over 2 decades, Marcela has championed trans rights in Latin America, co-authored Argentina's gender identity law. If you were not aware, Argentina is considered a global leader in trans rights, in large part thanks to this groundbreaking 2012 gender identity law. So fantastic that we have her here today. She also founded new institutional spaces like Casa Trans Buenos Aires and Centro de Documentación y Situación Trans de América Latina y el Caribe. Lo siento por mi pronunciación. Today, as president of the Association of Transvestites, Transsexuals, and Transgenders of Argentina, and as regional coordinator of Red Lac Trans, she supports data-driven advocacy, legal reform, and direct support for trans people across 18 countries. Unfortunately, a translator was not able to attend the live event, and so Francesca will summarize Marcela's remarks during the presentation. Thank you so much to Francesca for this last-minute offer, and side note for myself to always ensure your moderator is bilingual, because it sure comes in handy. Without further ado, I will pass it on to Francesca Traglia, again, the co-president of SGP, and to our panelists who will begin answering our first question. What forces, this can be social, political, religious, or economic, most shape the current anti-gender and anti-LGBTQI+ movements in your context? Javier will respond first.
Let me begin by saying thank you to the organizers and everybody who is joining. I know that there is Zoom fatigue, and to see this community connecting suggests that there's a lot of hope, that there's a lot of interest. Absolutely. We are living in the era of what I call homophobic populism. This is, in some countries, after a significant degree of progress in the early 2000s, what we're seeing is a backlash, and it has different degrees of intensity. In Latin America, what I have found in my own research is that the backlash is especially pronounced when you have the following characteristic. When you have the rise of the most conservative forms of religious expression. In Latin America, everybody knows that the region has long been Catholic, but what we have seen in the last 30 years is that a branch of Christianity, what we call evangelicals and fundamentalists, have expanded enormously. These groups are forming alliances with conservative forms of Catholicism. And when you see these two demographics grouping large, then you see really, really terrible alliances between civilian politicians and these religious groups advocating on behalf of rolling back on a great number of norms and rights that impact women's movements, LGBTQ movements, and many other rights. So in so many ways, we are seeing in the 20th century two contrasting trends. On the one hand, the number of people and organizations that are committed to advancing feminist and LGBTQ rights is expanding at a record level. But at the same time, religious conservatism is rising as well. And this is producing the clash in so many ways. Let me just leave it at that and let others offer their thoughts.
Fantastic. Thank you, Javier. I think I'll go after Javier. So my name is Amanda, and I'm going to speak from the context of Ghana and then West Africa in general. So I think for the African continent and then from West Africa, it's been a convergence of all these issues, social, political, religious, economic reasons. And they have played their various roles with, for starters, when it comes to social cultural norms where we position religion. Religion has been used as one of the foundational arguments for why LGBT issues are wrong. The moral approach to pushing against LGBT practices, which is against the Judeo-Christian religion, and also the connection with the evangelicals who are pushing this agenda of proper family values on the African continent. So it's been very foundational to whether we should embrace LGBT issues, support the community or not. And then we have the political angle, which has to do with, we also have positioned our traditional norms around what is accepted sexual practices, but then there are critiques around that, where there are publications point to the fact that we have always, as Africans, embraced sexual minorities and other sexual practices and other gender groups in our context through our traditional practices. When it comes to Ghana, for example, we have dances which are performed in traditional events, which we have men taking on performative roles of females. So it's been accepted like as part of our culture, but then with religious arguments, now we're pushing back, making it look as if everybody in Africa is a Judeo-Christian. And then for the political angles, I think the politicians have been used as the wheel to push and then to push a backlash against the LGBT community. With the power that they have, with the resource, with the voice and the following and the tools that they have to be able to push this agenda, they've been very critical. And also because then it is an avenue where they seek votes, more importantly. So if politicians are more up to levels of pushing back when they realize it's around election periods, or whenever there are economic issues or challenges where citizens are trying to hold them accountable, then they use LGBT issues as a cover. But then for a very long time, we've had politicians being the ones leading and spearheading the lawfare practices in Africa, basically. The laws that are passed through parliamentarians and led by politicians. So that's the angle that we have. And then when it comes to economic reasons, economics has been used as a reason for creating the vulnerability of the LGBT community, as if they don't have the agency and choice to be doing what they want to do or being who they want to be. When you look at all our bills and then the arguments that are presented by politicians, the point is that these are vulnerable people with poor economic resources, and they are being lured into LGBT practices with finances. So that presentation makes it look as if the LGBT persons have no agency, they have no stance. But luckily enough, it's also been economics has also been used as one tool for which in Ghana, for example, kept leaders in check when they were passing the LGBT bill. Because it got to a point where the Ministry of Finance in Ghana, for example, said, if they pass the bill, if the government passed the bill, then there will be consequences for us internationally when it comes to getting financial aid and all that. So these are ways that on the African continent, all those areas have come together to serve as a foundation for pushing back against the LGBT community. Yeah.
Thank you, Amanda. Brinda, would you like to go next?
Yes. Can you see me? I would really appreciate it if people who have their camera on can turn it off, because I have some bandwidth issue here. Thank you. So in terms of, I want to set the context first in terms of where I do work. I primarily do work on LGBTQ rights in South Asia and Belize as well. And these two areas, the geographies, and I would say Caribbean as well, right, are regions with a history of colonization and criminalization of homosexuality because of the history of colonization. And the way we see the current anti-gender and anti-LGBTQ movements playing out, this seems to be like a replay of the old scripts in these regions, right? Using religion and culture. So this at a local level is operating using religion and culture. Let me give you examples. For instance, also decriminalization, the status of decriminalization and criminalization also plays a critical part in these countries here. Even when you look at South Asia, there's Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka where homosexuality is still criminalized. India and Nepal have decriminalized homosexuality. Belize has decriminalized homosexuality as well. That said, these, like, the status of decriminalization has been rather recent, right, in the last few years. So that has had a significant impact as well. These countries have not still gotten used to fully making the situation friendly for the communities at large, and that is sort of giving room for these anti-gender actors to play out. When it comes to South Asia, there's a long history of the historical presence of the trans community in this region. However, even these communities are now being targeted, right? And with the recent US policy changes on the global front, these projects have taken like a massive hit in the region. In, say, countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, where there is criminalization still present, projects have been funded, the community projects have been funded under the guise of the gender diversity programs. And now, because gender at large has been targeted by the US policy changes, these programs have been like affected at large and lost economic power to have any sort of impact with the community, right? And and while Nepal and India have decriminalization going on, like, even projects there have been affected. And you can also see activists on the field in countries like Nepal note that there's been like a sudden shift within the mindset of parliamentarians, right? Suddenly now going with anti-queer policies within the parliament and pushing for it. And the conversations I've been having with organizations working with the Commonwealth nations and these regions largely observe that, politically speaking, and in the global front, the US the change in the US stand is sort of like made people go back on their positionality with respect to LGBTQ rights as well. They have sort of gone back. Previously, they had like a moral obligation because these developing countries were receiving funding, for instance, from the US, and had to say that they are actually pro-LGBTQ rights. Now they don't have the moral obligation as well. And so these countries which have made progressive developments over the recent years, even with their colonial history, are sort of going back on what they have done of sort on that front. So to begin with, this is largely the situation. You see funding loss even in, say, Belize and in the Caribbean as well. There, the church has been playing a very strong role. While in South Asia, especially in countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh, where Islam is practiced, that sort of has also impacted their, LGBT community and movements. There, it's propagated more as this is not our culture of sort. This is not our historical culture. This is Western. This is something that, we've learned from the West, is the sort of narrative that they're pushing more and more into the mainstream, especially with the recent sort of policy developments. But this is what I would like to share for now. I share rest as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Brinda, for stepping in. Before we move to Marcella, I just want to share and apologize that we, SGP, we weren't able to secure an interpreter, a simultaneous interpretation for today. So Marcella has been so kind to bear with us and try to participate as we have the other presentations. And I will try my very best to have a conversation with Marcela in Spanish. You will have captions in the bottom of your screen. And there will be a translation of the presentation today and the answers from Marcela in English on our website at a later date when we share the recording of today's event. But also we will have the translation in Spanish for all other participants who wish to join the conversation in Spanish. Marcela, muchas gracias por estar aquí y esperarnos y participar, aunque no hemos podido encontrar una interpretación para tu presentación hoy. Teníamos una pregunta para ti y te la voy a repetir en español, así vamos más rápido. La primera pregunta es, ¿qué fuerzas sociales, políticas, religiosas o económicas son las que más influyen en los actuales movimientos antigénero y anti-LGBTQ+, en contextos específicos?
Bueno, buenas a todos y todes. Primero quiero agradecer a los que generaron este espacio, a vos, Francesca, por estar ahí conduciendo y a todos los activistas que están poniendo todo para que podamos avanzar en el mundo y no dejar que el fascismo eh, nos quiera eliminar.
Okay, before I answer the question, I want to say thank you to all of those who have helped and create this space to share the work that we do in order to advance. I forgot gender. Yes, dime.
En Latinoamérica estamos pasando por un momento en la cual la oleada trans ha llegado a Latinoamérica de la mano de Bukele y de Milei, del presidente de El Salvador y del presidente argentino Milei, con, eh, con una estrategia de eliminar todo lo que es el tema de género desde la niñez y la adolescencia. Los riesgos y lo que tenemos en Latinoamérica, principalmente las iglesias evangélicas, eh, la cultura machista, patriarcal y el fascismo, que es lo que estamos en Latinoamérica continuamente enfrentada.
Super, voy a intentar. The great anti-trans that's arrived in Latin America has primarily entered via Argentina and Venezuela. There's translations of the two presidents there in the captions. They are targeting specific, it's a very anti-trans movement that's based on fascist approach, really looking to eliminate any conversations about gender directly from infancy and schooling.
Bien, bien.
Más no me acuerdo. Si quieres ir
No,
con frases más
está
fijas,
bien,
mejor.
está bien, me parece muy bien. Sí, sí, yo creo que lo que está pasando en Latinoamérica es una muerte social para la población trans.
Okay. What is happening, what I see happening in Latin America is the death of the trans community specifically through these processes.
Sí,
Gracias,
gracias.
Marcela. Super. Then hopefully it will be 60% of the translation that has come forward between the captions and my interpretation of Marcela's words. We'll go to a next question, which will direct specifically to Javier, if I may. In your work, having mapped mapped LGBTQ plus rights across Latin America, what lessons can Africa draw from both the successes and the setbacks in your region? Where are these international solidarity moments that matter most between the two continents?
Thank you. I don't want to be in a position to say that folks in Africa need to learn less, but I do want to offer some insights from the ups and downs of the struggles in Latin America. I think what helped Latin America the most during its golden age in expanding LGBTQ rights was the ability of socializations to engage in society and be very actively working in trying to change society that will never change. There are the enduring homo and transphobes. In many ways, forget about them. What you can do is to work with a large number of diverse people who are on that camp, and they still need quite a bit of help in trying to understand why this is a primordial human right. So in many ways, the audience has to be not so much on what Marcela was saying, the fascists or the transphobes, they're probably, or even the hyper-religious groups, but to work with other groups. The second important strategy, and this is, I'll just mention it very briefly, is when nothing was working, the societies, the civic groups in Latin America judicialized their struggles. They made sure that they could go to certain courts. They would try to find places where there could be the possibility. They could find test cases, judicial cases that stood a good chance of winning in court and having small judicial victories. This added up many times to overwhelming judicial changes over time. There was initially the fear that trying to change things through court rulings rather than legislation was going to be detrimental to the movement. No doubt there were negative consequences. Many people felt that this was not democratic. But in general, judicial rulings tended to have a significant degree of stickiness and sometimes even changed people's minds. Those are some of the two most important strategies. That said, I want to agree with everybody. This is the worst moment that we have faced in Latin America since the early 2000s. The combination of what's happening in the United States, as well as local versions of homophobic populism, are making things incredibly challenging.
Thank you, Javier, for your testimony here. I think to remain in the region, maybe we'll jump to Marcela, and I'll ask you a specific question on what organizing strategies and legal reforms have made the biggest difference for trans communities, and how can these be adapted beyond Argentina. Y espérame un segundo que te doy la traducción en español, que pasamos a ti porque así nos quedamos en la misma región y podemos escuchar tus aportaciones también aquí para esta pregunta. ¿Qué es? ¿Cuáles son las estrategias de organización y qué reformas legales han marcado la mayor diferencia para las comunidades trans y cómo pueden adaptarse más allá de Argentina?
Sí, primero, reforzar todo lo jurídico que hemos logrado en defensa de la comunidad LGBT y después usar las herramientas de denuncia en los juzgados y llegar a eh, la Corte Suprema de Derechos Humanos y en el sistema interamericano de derechos humanos. la única herramienta que tenemos en este momento son denunciar al gobierno en todos los lugares y poder eh, manifestarnos que también es peligroso porque ellos tienen ejércitos de los, de los roles en Internet que nos atacan continuamente, eh, una violencia muy fuerte hacia la comunidad trans, y eso es muy peligroso porque ellos trabajan en el tema de la salud mental hacia la población.
Vale, súper. Entonces, empezó explicando Marcela que es muy importante toda la labor. Ah, sorry.
A ver,
Yes. Sorry, in English.
no,
Marcela was sharing that the most important strategies to counter this anti-trans movement and something that can be adapted beyond Argentina begins with all the work that happens in documenting and using judicial reforms and violences that can be recorded so that we can lift all of these data to international system and also to advocate for the protection of these violations of rights in the country. Also, she shared that it's important to do a lot more not monitoring, I think it was security, sharing the information that there is a lot of drones and violence happening against the trans community online that really works to hinder the psychosocial well-being of activists working on this theme. And that's a space that really needs to be focused on. ¿Algo más que quieres añadir ahí?
no, lo que, lo que, lo que hacen ellos es atacarnos, y atacar a nuestra familia, a nuestros hijos, a nuestras parejas, eh, y eso es muy peligroso. En algunos países ya hay encarcelamientos eh, de mujeres trans y de sacarnos a nuestros hijos, eh, hijos del corazón y hijos biológicos, y ellos nos amenazan con eso.
Okay. So the only thing that she wanted to highlight further was that Marcela wanted to highlight further was the fact that there is specific targeting not only for trans women, but specifically for their partners and their families, and how these attacks or backlashes that they are feeling, and they're specifically targeting also the children that are both trans children and their own children that they are attacking, and this is very dangerous and harmful. Gracias. So we go back to English, and I would like to invite Brinda to answer the following question. Where have you seen digital activism and data become tools for both resistance and risks in India's LGBTQI plus movement? And what are the most urgent needs that you see now? And I'll turn off my camera for you.
Okay. Thank you. Like I was mentioning, I am not just speaking only about India, but I'm also speaking about South Asia, and based on my work in Belize and the Caribbean as well, is that, like I mentioned before, between these two regions, it is very important to understand the presence and the absence of trans rights. Like if you look at Belize, there is actually no presence of or any sort of recognition of trans rights in that context. Whereas in South Asia, there's been a historic presence of the trans community, right? And like I mentioned before, that language has sort of been used before to, fund projects that also support the LGBTQ community at large as well. So now, with the recent US policy developments, this has affected funding in both these regions in different ways. But what is important to understand when we're talking about data, right? We need to understand that when projects are not funded, then evidence is not built on certain communities. So when you say that there's not going to be any projects now funded under the label of LGBTQ, which means we're essentially erasing this entire community to say that this population does not have any problems. In some sense, without the data, it just becomes that this population does not even exist. And this is very critical when we're talking about digital data and like digital as a tool as well, right? Because everything that we do and say and everything there is sort of building evidence in some sense as data for collectivized activism, and like as a collective as such, right? And in that sense, if you look at it, there are three different things that are playing hand in hand. One is the government targeting, which like politically as well, and by defunding projects through US policy changes and other European countries as well, following the US, European countries have also sort of gone back on funding these projects across the world. And what that means is we don't have data on this population, which means that this population might not even exist. This is on the political, socio-political front and even economic. Now, when you look at it from a completely digital angle perspective, what is happening with social media is that big tech and social media plays to the tunes of the governments in power in all these different countries, not just these countries, but in the world at large right now. So if the government is more progressive, then they will be progressive with like their data and what they allow on these platforms and what they filter and don't filter out on these platforms. And if the government and the local laws, because ultimately their business motive is primary for them. So then there is then that, erasure and saying that we do not promote LGBT narratives and stories and like rights in being in compliance with the local laws. So compliance with local laws is the front that they sort of pose to allow for or like turn a blind eye towards all the online violence that happens against the LGBT community. And also in specific contexts, if you see in like, there have been examples, let's say in countries like Pakistan, for instance, where there is actually a pro-trans law in the country. They have sort of a lot of online disinformation has set in to sort of set in this agenda of saying that anything that is actually trans, pro-trans is actually pro-LGB. It's actually promoting or supporting the gay community is the sort of narrative they are pushing towards. In fact, based on such a case that the police tried to take action and found that there was no evidence there. This was just purely online disinformation that had happened. Similarly, in other contexts, let's say like in Sri Lanka, online hate speech and anti-LGBT has now been normalized. I mean, this is again a criminalized context, right? And this has happened more so with the recent US policy changes and the US government change. So more people are now forthcoming to actually speak anti-LGBTQ online more vocally, right? And that is happening on, in terms of the social media platforms. And the accountability has also become lesser because, like I mentioned, social media platforms are saying that they are in compliance of the local laws. And on the community front, if they go to the police, let's say to file complaints, for instance, they target the community instead of actually protecting them. For instance, in many of these cases, like this is very fascinating for me to see that these examples are predominantly common across like South Asia and halfway across the world, even in a country like Belize, right? So it's fascinating for me that because of the history of criminalization of homosexuality, that if you invariably they have laws which is anti, not necessarily porn, but modesty of sort, right? There is some kind of cultural policing. So the fact that you have, let's say you sent a video or you had a video on your phone which you sent to your partner or something, some intimate sort of images or videos, the fact that you had them on the phone, the fact that they got leaked is not such a problem with the police. The police instead targets the survivor, saying that you had this particular video or image on your phone, which means you had the intention of sharing it, right? So what they do instead is they target the survivor and sort of file cases against them. So what also happens in terms of extortion, which is very common within the LGBT community, they sort of are scared to go to the police and they are scared to sort of approach and file a complaint because the police in turn targets them instead of actually protecting them, right? And in some cases, like specifically in Belize, I was told queer people are forced to go to the media to file a complaint because the police atrocity is sort of revealed in the media, the police then they don't want to sort of be projected or like presented in a bad light. So then they come forward to support the community and file complaints. So community is also forced to sort of like do their own workarounds of this sort to navigate the kind of situations that they face online right now. I wouldn't say exactly that the situation is great. Digital activism, if you say something has worked, I would only say that crowdfunding seems to have worked over and over time because organizations have been recently targeted a lot with all these policy changes and, foreign fund transfers, laws locally which target foreign fund transfer, etc. So what then happens is this power in numbers. When the collective, when people at large as individuals come forward, like what happened also during COVID, right? People coming forward to actually contribute from the individual funds has sort of, even now, sort of mobilized funds for people through digital modes. So these are specifically the things I want to sort of highlight right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Brinda. I would like then now to pass to... Okay, I'll just put my camera on. We'll pass to Amanda with a specific question on how are intersectionality and feminist organizing meeting the challenges of lawfare, and how have they intensified criminalization in Ghana and West Africa?
I would say in Ghana and in West Africa, I think feminists have played a very critical role in supporting the LGBT community against the criminalization and other discriminatory practices. I would say that as being most of the people that have led the support for the community have been feminist academics, and with the understanding of intersectionality as a tool and a framework, understanding how we need to look at groups not as one, and then looking at the differences and using that language. They had a language to be able to engage policymakers, to be able to engage legal issues, and this has offered a lot of support. They shaped issues around how to tease out oppression that is being faced by the LGBT community. And also, you will find that in most of the push for the anti-LGBT legislations that are coming up, the lawfare, the court cases in Uganda, for example, and in Ghana, were led by feminists. We have also had feminist groups that have undertaking capacity building activities for the community. They've also had the spaces to be able to do advocacy to support and raise awareness around the community, challenging the language that is being used and also through publications and offering safe spaces for the LGBT community. I also find that one critical thing about feminism, its connection with intersectionality and LGBT lawfare, has been the appreciation of feminist movements and feminist organizing, and how these feminists have understood over time, and with the struggles that they have gone through, to be able to raise concerns about women's discrimination. So they have already been in these spaces, and therefore putting themselves out there made it easy for them to be able to stand up and be able to support the community in ways that other groups are not doing. And also the space that they have had to be able to be teaching. Personally, for example, in Ghana's case, I was one of the plaintiffs for the Supreme Court, trying to stop the legislation, the anti-LGBT bill. And this is not, even though I was the plaintiff, there are other feminists that were in the background supporting. When the bill was being discussed in Parliament, for example, we had a lot of women's groups and feminist groups sending their memos, raising issues, critical intersectional issues around gender, how religion, how this power and how discrimination has implication for the lives of the LGBT persons. So for us in Africa, and for us in Ghana, most importantly, I find that intersectionality and feminism has been a very important tool, given the language to support the LGBT community, given the space to be able to stand up and the voice to be able to speak up for the LGBT community. And then with the intensified criminalization, yes, again, then I would say, had it not been some of these women standing up, some of these feminists, sorry for the words I say women, but then most of them that I've led, I have identified as women. So had it not been there standing up and standing in for the members of the community, then probably the voices that the community needed at that point wouldn't have come up. Because at some point, I find that coming from the community, it's not because the community could not speak, but already targeted and looked down upon. Their voices, they are mobilizing, was not really getting them kind of attention. But with these feminists stepping into the place, they helped with calming down this intensified criminalization issues. Ghana's bill did not pass because the feminists stood up and fought it. Even though Uganda's bill was passed, there were a lot of voices, there were a lot of awareness that was raised around that time. And within that window, that brought consciousness as to why it is important not to look at the LGBT community, for example, as a vulnerable group. And the fact that they are very critical people, we have medical doctors, we have lawyers, we have legal personalities and all that in there. So that awareness also changed mindsets. I remember in one of the conversations where we were doing media engagement as feminist groups in Ghana, people will reach out and say, well, they didn't understand the issue the way it was. When people were trying to break down the bill to educate people, that's when people got the awareness to understand. And because of that, right now, when people raise LGBT issues, then there's this awareness that there are more important economic issues that we need to discuss than to talk about LGBT issues. They are not our problem. And this all has to do with the advocacy, the engagement of feminist groups with the supporting their community, giving them the language and the tools to understand how to engage and what issues to raise. So I would say that this is how the connection has come together for us in West Africa, and how it has helped us in addressing the wave of criminalization that's happening in the African continent. It's not like we've been successful, but at least there's as much of awareness that there are more important issues, and how politicians tend to use LGBT persons as a shield against any criticism. So anytime there's an issue, anytime there are economic challenges, then they raise those issues and bring them. So now people are getting more conscious around these issues and getting more support and community. There are feminists who have also used social media platforms, traditional media platforms, to engage in conversations and raise awareness. And this has been very critical and important for us as well. So I would say, when it comes to issues around criminalization and addressing LGBT issues on the African continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. So I have one last question to the panel before we open up to questions from the floor. So I'll ask you, if you're actively wanting to engage with the panelists, please do draft your questions in the chat so that we can pose them to our guests today. I have one question to all of you, and is specifically on how do we best connect local struggles and transnational support to defend gender and sexuality rights in the face of all of this backlash. And perhaps we can go to Javier first, since you were the last to speak.
Thank you. The LGBTQ movement, in my opinion, has been one of the most successful movements in doing exactly this historically. It is a movement that has always consumed information from abroad and produced alliances. I don't think I have any new insight other than what we know. One thing that I do want to say is that it is very important, especially in places like South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to make the point that homophobia is a colonial import. Many times, you hear in public discourse the idea that it is LGBTQ rights that it is being brought in from outside, from external actors. And there is a way to counter that argument with empirical evidence and to suggest that this is one of the biggest vestiges of colonialism and its strongest forms, and especially 19th century forms of colonialism, which Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia were the most biggest recipients of. So it is very important to generate that public discourse. Now, having said that, I think we heard from Brenda an incredibly essential and important point, which is with the rise of homophobic populism in the United States and the termination of a lot of international aid to local community, this is a really existential threat to many societies that don't have alternative sources of funding. So yeah, the situation is grim, and maybe we have the one tool that Marcela emphasized from the very beginning, the tool of speaking out of and being able to denounce the human rights regresses that we're observing. Thank you.
Thank you, Javier. So we're going to jump right to Marcela, who can contribute to this question that we've highlighted, also what you previously have shared with us, and I'll do it in Spanish. Marcela, te invito a responder a la próxima pregunta, que es cómo podemos conectar de la mejor manera las luchas locales y el apoyo transnacional para defender los derechos de género y sexuales frente a la reacción adversa que estamos viviendo en este momento.
Creo que es necesario hacer una evaluación de qué nos pasa con la democracia. Hay un tema de democracias débiles. Y creo que lo que tenemos que hacer o que podamos es frenar la violencia de género, los crímenes de odio, y creo que hay que hacer más informes sobre los abusos que hay a los derechos humanos, pero con nombres y apellidos. Y eso ese nombre y apellido son los gobiernos. Hay que hacerlos responsables a los gobiernos. En Latinoamérica estamos atravesadas por la pobreza y la pobreza viene de la mano de la exclusión social y la marginalidad. Eh, Nos está atravesando eh, el narcotráfico. eh, Creo que eh, eso nos está llevando a una a, a democracias. eh, yo lo que veo en la región es esta disputa, que es democracia versus gobierno. La democracia va por un lado y los gobiernos van por otro lado. Eh, yo creo que es necesario un, un plan de urgencia de la comunidad LGBT del mundo, con todas las herramientas que en todos estos años eh, pudimos ejecutar, pero no estuvimos, no, a ver, no estuvimos eh, precavidas en tener un plan de urgencia. Esto nos pasó también con el COVID. El COVID fue el primer inicio de, eh, de que la sociedad no estaba preparada para, no tenía un plan de urgencia, nunca tuvimos un plan de urgencia y nos está pasando ahora también. No hay un plan de urgencia. Gracias.
Gracias, Marcela. Voy a intentar lo mejor que pueda. So Marcela began her conversation by highlighting the concept of how we are living democracy today and how is it that governments are allowing for real democracy to take place. And she explains how her continent is afflicted by a number of different challenges, namely poverty, trafficking, narco trafficking, and other challenges that are intersecting with this big backlash against the trans community. She pushes the idea that we need to hold governments accountable, that we need to have names of perpetrators and to document what we are witnessing so that we can ensure that we are pushing back on the backlash and ensuring that we're holding these entities accountable, and to do it with all of the tools and all of the resources that we were able to develop in past years where we weren't facing this big emergency. And she calls us to build an emergency plan of the LGBTQI community to work together to ensure that we build a way of collectively push back through this emergency plan. Gracias, Marcela. Y I'll go to... ¿Tienes algo más que añadir o está bien? Sí.
Está bien,
Okay.
Marcela, gracias.
So we can go to Amanda. Would you like to answer this specific question? Would you like me to ask you again, just to go back into English mode?
Yeah, I think so. That'd be great because I was trying to read it.
How do we best? So the question is for you and Brinda, so that you can also bring your perspectives in. How do we best connect local struggles and transnational support to defend gender and sexual rights in the face of backlash?
Yes. Again, I'm going to speak from what we have done in Ghana, and also I know like some spaces. First, I want to also make it clear that I belong to a number of feminist groups on the African continent, and key of them is that you find that we have feminists coming from different places in Africa and other spaces. So I think one thing that we do as one approach that we do to connect the local struggles with transnational struggles is to first have an understanding of what you have. So we already know what is happening in each country. When you read, you see it. So when an issue comes up, what I find that most of it we do as feminists is using our social media platforms to raise concerns around when the issues pop up. So this is happening here. There's a potential that this can happen here. So how do you raise or concerns around that? So if like there is if there's a case in, let's say, in the US, one thing we find that when Trump started making utterances around LGBT issues, how attacking the trans community, there were concerns that were raised about the potential spillover to the other countries and how it's going to create a lot of backlash. So then we came together to have a conversation. How do we support the community? What issues will come up? What is the potential for this struggle that we're already having on the African continent, and what do we do? So first is the awareness of what's happening around and connecting and also finding solutions. And then what I know is that when issues are happening in other spaces, feminists come together to offer support, solidarity messages through sometimes letter of support, signing petitions and all that. So those are ways that feminists I know are connecting their struggle and trying to connect their local and transnational struggles to fight for this independence. I think what has also been effective is that feminists have already been in these spaces and raising issues around gender. So adding LGBT issues around and adding it to the gender struggles and raising those concerns is quite easy and makes it possible to be able to do that. So I think how we can do that is for us in our various spaces, know what kind of community is available, who already have an understanding of the issue that we are interested in, who already have the voice, who already have the language to be able to engage, and how we offer them the information and the tools to lead this. Because and also not relying only on face-to-face policy engagement and doing that. Also using other non-traditional approaches like the digital platforms and I think what has also been effective for me, as far as I know, is how you position the language and how you do it. And connecting research with advocacy, grassroots mobilizing is something that has been very effective. And then sometimes when gender issues come up and let's say, and is making waves, you can just also at that point connect other issues to it. So for me, what I use my personal page platforms to do is if there are any issues around gender, like the 16 days of activism, digital activism, I'm not raising issues only about gender-based violence, which is between heterosexuals, but you raise other minority issues that draw attention to the fact that this is not just a single struggle that happens to only women or happens only to men, but then there are other groups that you can look at as well. So these are ways that I see other feminists and I see women's group in Ghana and some other African spaces I belong to engage their spaces, connecting local struggles with transnational struggles and the platforms that they're using to be able to do this. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Brinda, I'll give you the floor and I'll just take off my camera.
Yeah. So in terms of connecting the transnational and local movements, I'm going to look at this in two different ways, right? Like I said, in my recent work with speaking to different networks involved with LGBTQ organizations across the Commonwealth, I've been, when I'm talking about global north countries. Some of these countries are like being forced to now take on sort of a different narrative to be able to support LGBTQ related work. There's a sort of pushback right now on the language of gender as well as human rights because of these recent US policy changes, and my recent work has been on sort of recording and observing these changes due to the US policies, recent change in the US administration. So that's also why I've been repeatedly mentioning this particular development. So they have been using things like, I'm hearing organizations, networks, let's say in the UK, for instance, are using the narrative of why LGBTQ movement needs to be supported is because anti-democratic actors like, say, Russia and China are sort of using LGBT narrative to sort of anti-LGBT narrative to go against democracy, and that's also why we need to be pro-LGBT. So why I'm talking about, not specifically speaking in terms of what is right or wrong narrative, I'm just sort of pointing out here the different ways in which organizations and networks and countries are sort of trying to circumvent the current anti-gender situation of sorts to find ways to sort of support the movement in countries which are lesser like, or have lesser access than the rest compared to the rest. When we're looking at in terms of the more like, and also when I'm talking about global north, what I also would like here in this platform as well to put forth is that to understand individually that our trauma as feminists, as queer feminists, first, are we all as feminists, queer feminists, and like supportive, and when I say queer feminists, supportive of trans realities as well, and that's so important. And to understand that all of us come with different kinds of privileges and disadvantages because of various factors, right? And the way marginalization is experienced in all these different contexts are different, and it's important for us within the movement spaces to be open to listening and like prioritize voices that do not have as much space as, let's say, we do. Like, it is my responsibility without taking on the narrative of other marginalized communities within my context. I need to also be able to speak about their realities. Although I'm non-binary identifying, there are trans people, let's say trans Dalit people, who are far more marginalized because of their gender and caste identity, let's say in a context like India. It is important that I also talk about the intersectional marginalization that they face while I speak on a platform like this, without sort of taking over their narrative, but to say that this is based on the accounts of, let's say, activists that I have spoken to during my research, during my work, like Grace Banu, like Vaijayanti, and these are all, activists who work on trans Dalit issues in a country like India. So it is appropriation is the word. Without appropriating, can those of us working within movement spaces make space, literally pass on the mic, right? And when our contexts are really different, can we be open to understanding that marginalization looks different for all of us in all these different contexts? And that is so important right now to create solidarity. And for us, like I mentioned before, when organizations are being targeted and laws are being used to sort of prevent foreign funding from coming in, can we look at coming forth as individuals to support movements, to contribute individually to, because there is number in the collective, for us to sort of come forth and support as allies, even if we are scared that we would be seen as part of being part of the community. And I'm saying without compromising sort of our personal, safety, can we support as well like that? These are some very crucial things at this point that we need to focus on as individuals, because more and more avenues are sort of shutting down. And I would like to sort of repeat Javier's words here as well in like a slightly different way. We have done this before as a movement, as LGBTQ movement across the world. If one movement that has actually decriminalized homosexuality across many countries over a period of time, it is this particular like movement. And we have done this like purely through people holding each other across the world, right? And I think we can definitely do it again by doing exactly that. We've done it before and we'll do it again, is what I'd like to leave us with. Thank you.
So we begin with a big thank you to the panelists, and I didn't want to miss the opportunity to open the floor for all of you still here with us today to allow you to come forward, share your thoughts and what resonated most with you today from today's presentations and conversations. And if you had any questions for the panelists, I would like to give you the floor so that you can do that today. And I will just jump and try and see if there are any questions in the chat space.
And that is it for today. We kept our Q&A confidential and unrecorded, but you can check out the summary report on our website for an overview of everything that we discussed today. You can find more information about the Kindle Project and the Society of Gender Professionals online, and we look forward to many more conversations around gender justice in the future.